don't become afraid of it, but suffer as much pain as possible, they will, by this method, overcome the problem of pain. And they will set themselves free from anxiety. There's a certain sense in that, as you can obviously see. Supposing, for example, you have absolutely no fear of pain. You have no anxieties, you have no hang-ups. How strong you would be. Nobody could stop you. You would have ultimate courage. But the Buddha was very subtle. He is really the first historical psychologist, the great psychologist, psychotherapist. He is very subtle because he saw that a person who is fighting pain, who's trying to get rid of pain, is still really fundamentally afraid of it. And therefore, the way of asceticism is not right. Equally, the way of hedonism, of seeking pleasure, is not right. So the Buddha's doctrine is called the middle way, which is neither ascetic nor hedonistic. So it's summed up in what are called the Four Noble Truths. And the first is called dukkha. Dukkha means suffering in a very generalized sense. You could call it chronic frustration. And it is saying that life as lived by most people is dukkha. Is an attempt, in other words, to solve insoluble problems. Try to draw a square circle. You can't, because the problem itself is meaningless. Try to arrange the things in this room so that they're all up and none of them down. It is meaningless. Such a problem cannot ever be solved. So try to have light without dark, or dark without light. It can never be solved. So the attempt to solve problems that are basically insoluble and to work at it through your whole life, that is dukkha. Now, he went on to analyze this, that there are what he called three signs of being. The first is dukkha itself, frustration. The second is anitya. And this means the letter A in Sanskrit at the beginning of a word is often the equivalent of our non. So nitya means permanent, anitya means impermanent. That every manifestation of life is impermanent. And therefore, our quest to make things permanent, to straighten everything out, to get it fixed, is an impossible and insoluble problem. And therefore, we experience dukkha, or this sense of fundamental pain and frustration, as a result of trying to make things permanent. And the third sign of being is called anatman. Now, you know from my talk on Hinduism that the word atman means self. Anatman means therefore non-self. That there is in you no real ego. Now, I've explained that already. I've explained in talking about Hinduism that the idea of the ego is a social institution. It has no physical reality. It is simply, the ego is your symbol of yourself. Just as the word water is a noise which symbolizes a certain liquid reality, so the idea of the ego, the role you play, who you are, is not the same as your living organism. Your ego has absolutely nothing to do with the way you color your eyes, shape your body, circulate your blood. That's the real you. But it's certainly not your ego, because you don't even know how it's done from the standpoint of your conscious attention. So the idea of anatman is firstly that the ego is unreal. There isn't one. Now then, this then is the first truth. There is this situation that we have dukkha, or frustration, because we are fighting the changingness of things, and because we don't realize that the ego, the I, is unreal. The second of the Four Noble Truths is then called Trishna. Trishna is a Sanskrit word again, and is the root of our word thirst. And it's usually translated desire, but it is better translated clinging, grabbing, or there's an excellent modern American slangy word, hang up. That is exactly what Trishna is, a hang up. Trishna is clutching. As, for example, what we call smother love. When a mother is so afraid that her children may get into trouble, that she protects them excessively. And as a result of this, prevents them from growing. Or when lovers cling to each other excessively and have to sign documents that they will curse and swear to love each other always, they are in a state of trishna. And this is the same thing as holding on to yourself so tightly that you strangle yourself. Now, so the second truth then about trishna is that the cause of dukkha is trishna. Clinging is what makes suffering. If you don't recognize that this whole world is a phantasmagoria, an amazing illusion, a weaving of smoke, and you try to hold on to it, you see, then you start suffering, seriously suffering. Trishna is in turn based upon avidya, the same negative, vidya, from the root vid, means knowledge, as in the Latin video and the English vision. Avidya, therefore, is ignorance. Gnosis, gna, means, of course, to know. Knowledge is the same thing as gnosis in Greek. To know. So this is not to know, to ignore, to overlook. And I explained in the first talk in this series how we ignore all kinds of things because we notice only what we think noteworthy. And therefore our vision of everything is highly selective. We pick out certain things and say that's what's there, just as we select and notice the figure rather than the background. Sometimes I draw this on the blackboard and ask the question, what have I drawn? What would you say? What have I drawn? The circle. Any other suggestions? Yeah, you're getting the point. I've drawn a wall with a hole in it, you see? But ordinarily, you've been reading my books. So, but ordinarily people see the ball, the circle, the ring or whatever, and never think of the background because they ignore the background. Just as one thinks that you can have pleasure without pain. You want pleasure of the figure and don't realize that pain is the background. So avidya is this state of restricted consciousness, restricted attention that moves through life unaware of the fact that to be implies not to be, and vice versa. So now the third noble truth is called nirvana. This word means blow out. Nira is a negative word, again, like ah. Vana is blowing. So it's a kind of outblowing. Now, in breathing, you know that breath is life. The Greek word, you may pronounce it pneuma or pneuma, is the same as spirit. And spirit means breath. In the book of Genesis, when God had made the clay figurine that was later to be Adam, he breathed the breath of life into its nostrils. And it became alive, because life is breath. But now, if you hold your breath, you lose it. He that would save his life will lose it. So breathe in, breathe in, breathe in, get as much air as you can, and Trishna, cling, and you lose it. So nirvana means breathe out. What a relief that was. The sigh of relief. Let it go, because it'll come back to you if you let it go. But if you don't let it go, you'll just suffocate. So a person in the state of nirvana is what we might call a blown out person. Like blow your mind. Let go. Don't cling. And then you're in the state of nirvana. And I re-emphasize the point. I'm not preaching, see? I'm not saying this is what you ought to do. I'm simply pointing out a state of affairs that is so. There's no moralism in this whatsoever. It's simply pointing out, like, if you put your hand into the fire, you'll get burned. You can get burned if you want to. That's okay. But if it so happens that you don't want to get burned, then you don't put your hand in the fire. So in the same way, if you don't want to be in a state of anxiety all the time, and again I emphasize, if you like to be anxious, it's perfectly all right. See, Buddhism never hurries anyone on. They say, you've got all eternity through which to live in various forms. And therefore, you don't have just one life in which you've got to avoid eternal damnation. You can go running around the wheel and the rat race and play that game just as long as you want to, so long as you think it's fun. But if there comes a time when you don't think it's fun, you don't have to do it. So I wouldn't say to anyone who disagrees with me and who says, well, I think we ought to engage the forces of evil in battle and put this world to right and so on and so forth and arrange everything in this world so that it's all up. Try it, please. It's perfectly okay. Go on doing that. But if you see that it's futile, then you can let go. Don't try to cling. Relax. And if you do that, you're in the state of nirvana. And you become a Buddha. And of course it means that you become a rather astonishing person. You may, of course, be subtle about it and make like you're a very ordinary person so that you don't get people mixed up. Because if you are a very astonishing person, everybody wants to be like you. And they use you as an object of trishna, of clinging. They rely on you. You get a transference on you. Everybody comes running around and says, please help me. I'd like to be like you are. And then you have to get rid of them. See, that's the difference between a doctor and a clergyman. I shouldn't say things like this, but doctors try to get rid of their patients. Clergymen try Clergymen try to get them hooked on the medicine so that they will become addicts to the church. And that's too bad, because there is a saying in ancient Christianity, crux medicina mundi, which means the cross, the medicine of the world. But you don't make medicine a diet. And so in Buddhism, the Buddha explained that his doctrine, his method, was a raft. It's sometimes called a yana. The word Y-A-N-A, yana, means a vehicle, a conveyance. And when you cross a river on a raft, and you get to the other shore, you don't pick up the raft and carry it on your back. You leave it behind. But people who are what I would call hooked on religion are always on the raft. They're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth on the raft. So the clergyman tends to turn into a ferryman who's always on the raft and never gets over to the other shore himself. Now, there's something to be said for that, because how are we going to get the raft back to the first shore to bring over the other people? See? Somebody has to volunteer to take the back journey. But he must be awfully careful to realize that the real objective is to get the people across and set them free. If you dedicate yourself to ferrying people across, don't ask them to come back on the raft with you, because you'll get overcrowded and people will think that the raft is the goal rather than the other shore. So when I find this in actual practice, that when clergymen do not ever ask for money, and it's all right, you know, like a doctor who simply charges a fee, says, you come to me, you pay me so much. But the clergyman says, he doesn't say pay me so much, he says, we would like your pledge, your voluntary contribution. See, and then nobody knows what to give. But he has to go calling around all sorts of places. He becomes a fundraiser for this big project, the church. And it's a bad scene. Because if any church were really successful in liberating people, there would be no problems of economics at all. Because people would keep coming. As soon as you got rid of people, like a doctor who gets rid of people becomes famous because they're cured. And so if in a certain church scene, people are cured and they all therefore leave the church, more come in. There's a perpetual tide of more people. So you get a huge turnover. And that's the way to work it. That's the idea of the raft. Now then, the fourth noble truth is called marga. This word means path. And the way of Buddhism is often called the Noble Eightfold Path, because there are 8 phases. I won't say steps, because they're not sequential. They're all simultaneous. It really, all of them are subsumed under 3 headings, of which you can say that right view, which in Sanskrit is samyak. Samyak is a very curious phrase. It doesn't mean right in our sense of correct. Sam is the same really as our word sum. Total, complete, all-inclusive. We might use the word integrated, as when we say a person has integrity. That a person who has integrity, we mean he's all of a piece. He's not divided against himself. So in this sense of samyak drishti, this is related to the word darshan, which means a point of view or viewing. When you go to visit a great guru or teacher, you have darshan, you look at him and you offer your reverence to him, darshan. Many senses of it, but it means simply to view. Look at the view. So the samyak darshan is the complete view. For example, let's take the constellation called the Big Dipper. We look at it from a fairly restricted zone in space, and it always seems, whatever the season of the year, because we're so far away from it, that those stars in the Big Dipper are in the same position. But imagine looking at it from somewhere else in space altogether, and those stars would not look like a dipper. They'd be in another position. Now then, what is the true position of those stars? Don't you see there isn't one? Because wherever you look, the position alters. You could say that the true situation of those stars is how they are looked at from all points of view, all possible points of view. Inside the constellation, looking outwards, outside the constellation, looking inwards, from everywhere and everywhere. But you see, there is no such thing as the truth. The world, in other words, is not existing independently of those who witness it. Because the world is precisely the relationship between the world and its witnesses. Just as the sound of a drum is the relationship between a striking hand and the skin. If there's no skin on the drum, it doesn't make any sound. And so if there are no eyes in this world, the sun doesn't make any light, nor do the stars. So what is a relationship. You can, for example, prop up two sticks by leaning them against each other, and they will stand. But only by depending on each other. Take one away and the other falls. So in Buddhism, it is taught that everything in this universe depends on everything else. That we have a kind of a huge network, and this is called the doctrine of mutual interdependence. All of it hangs on you, and you hang on all of it, just as the two sticks support each other. And this is conveyed in a symbol which is called Indra's net. Imagine a multidimensional spider's web in the early morning covered with dewdrops. And every dewdrop contains the reflection of all the other dewdrops. And in each reflected dewdrop, the reflections of all the other dewdrops in that reflection. And so ad infinitum. That is the Buddhist conception of the universe, in an image. The Japanese call that Jiji Muge. A ji means a thing event, a happening. So between happening and happening, mu, there is no ge separation. Jiji Muge. So the first phase of the Eightfold Path has to do with one's understanding of the world. The second phase has to do with action, how you act. And here we get the Buddhist view of behavior. A Buddhist doesn't base his ethics on the idea of commandments, of orders from a higher echelon of authority. Buddhist idea of ethics is based on expediency. If you are engaged in the way of liberation and you want to clarify your consciousness, doing that is inconsistent with certain kinds of action. So every Buddhist makes 5 vows, 5 precepts. And you may perhaps have heard the Buddhist formula of taking what is called Panchasila, the 5 precepts. And they take what are called Tisarana, the 3 refuges and the 5 precepts. The refuges are the Buddha, the Dharma, the doctrine, and the Sangha, the fellowship of all those who are on the way. So the priest, the bhikkhu, the Buddhist monk, and the lay people will chant the formula. Buddhang saranang gacchami, Dhanghang saranang gacchami, Sanghang saranang gacchami. Those are the 3 refuges, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Then they take the 5 precepts. Panatipata veramani sikapadang samadhiyami. Adinadana veramani sikapadang samadhiyami. Kamesu michachara veramani sikapadang samadhiyami. Musavada veramani sikapadang samadhiyami. Kamesu michara suramerya majapamadatana veramani sikapadam samadhiyami. So they take these 5 precepts. Panatipata. I undertake the precept to abstain from taking life. Adinadana. I undertake the precept to abstain from taking what is not given. Kamesu mityahara. I undertake the precept to abstain from exploiting the passions. Musavada. I undertake the precept to abstain from falsifying speech. Sura merya majapamadatana. I undertake the precept to abstain from being intoxicated by sura, merya, and majapamadatana, whatever they were. If you exploit your passions, it means that when you feel bored and somehow that life is a little bit empty, you say, well, now what are we going to do this evening? Let's go and get stuffed. You know, a lot of people who suffer from obesity are trying to simply fill their empty psyche by stuffing themselves with food. Well, it's the wrong cure. Likewise, musavada, if you start telling lies to everybody, you know what happens when you start telling lies. You have to tell extra lies to cover up the first one, and you get into the most hopeless misunderstanding. Speech collapses. And of course, the intoxication is the same problem as the exploitation of the passions. So there's a purely kind of practical, expedient, utilitarian approach to morals. There's another side to this, which I will explain later. So that's the second phase. Then the third phase has to do with your mind, with your state of consciousness. And this has to do with what we would ordinarily call meditation. The 7th and 8th aspects of the path are called Samyak Smriti and Samyak Samadhi. Smriti means recollection. That's the best English word for it. Now, do you understand? The word recollect is to gather together what has been scattered. What is the opposite of remember? Obviously, dismember. What has been chopped up and scattered becomes remembered. So in the Christian scheme, do this in remembrance of me. You see, the Christ has been sacrificed, chopped up. But the Mass is celebrated in remembrance. One of the old liturgies says the wheat which has been scattered all over the hills and grows up is gathered again into the bread. Remembered. Go back to your Hindu basis. The world is regarded as the dismemberment of the self, the Brahman, the Godhead. The one is dismembered into the many. So remembrance is realizing again that each single member of the many is really the one. So that's recollection. You can think of it too in another way, and it's really the same way if you think it through. I'm going to leave you with a few puzzles so that you can think them through, and I won't explain them. But another way is to be recollected, is to be completely here and now. Are you here and now? Are you really here? There was a wise old boy who used to give lectures on these things, and he would get up and not say a word. He would just look at the audience. He'd examine every person individually. They'd all start feeling uncomfortable. He wouldn't say anything. He'd look at them. Then he'd suddenly say, "Wake up! You're all asleep. And if you don't wake up, I won't give you any lecture." Are you here, recollected? See, most people aren't. They're bothering about yesterday and wondering what they're going to do tomorrow. And aren't all here. That's the definition of sanity, to be all there. So to be recollected is to be completely alert, available for the present. Because that's the only place that you are ever going to be in. Yesterday doesn't exist, tomorrow never comes. There is only today. A great Sanskrit invocation says, "Look to this day, for it is life." In its brief course lie all the realities of our existence. Yesterday is but a memory. Tomorrow is only a vision. Look well then to this day. Such is the salutation of the dawn. So, Shmiti means then recollectedness in the sense of being all here. In the sense that this is the only where there is. Then beyond that comes samadhi. Again, notice the presence of this word S-A-M, sam. Samadhi is integrated consciousness in which there is no further separation between the knower and the known, the subject and the object. You are what you know. Now we think in the ordinary way that we are the witnesses of a constantly changing panorama of experience, from which we as the knowers of this in a way stand aside and watch it. We think of our minds as a kind of tablet upon which experience writes a record. And the tablet is always there, although the experience goes by. And eventually the experience, by writing so much on the tablet, wears it out. It's all scratched away and you die, see? But actually, if you will investigate this, and you have to experiment on this because I cannot explain it to you in words, you can only find it out for yourself. There is no difference between the knower and the known. When you say, I see a sight, I feel a feeling, you are using redundant language. I see implies the sight. I feel implies the feeling. Do you hear sounds? No. You just hear. Or you can say there are sounds. Either one will do. So you will find, if you thoroughly investigate the process of experiencing, that the experiencing is the same as the experiencing. And this is the state of samadhi. I put it originally in this form, that the organism and the environment are a single behavioral process. So, likewise, is the knower and the known. So you, as someone who is aware, and all that you are aware of is one process. That is the state of samadhi. And you get to that state by the practice of meditation. Every Buddha figure practically is seen in the sitting posture of meditation, which is sitting down quietly and being aware of all that goes on without comment, without thinking about it. And when you stop categorizing, verbalizing, talking to yourself inside your head, naturally the separations between, for example, knower and known, self and other, simply vanish. Can you point to the difference between my 5 fingers? It just isn't there in the physical world. Of course, that's not saying that the fingers are joined like a duck's claws with a web. But it's just that. They're not the same. That's an idea. They're not different. That's an idea. And these ideas just aren't here. See? You can't point to it. You can't put your finger on it. Get then to the state of affairs where you see the world free from concepts. That's what Buddhists mean by void. When they say the world is basically, they use the phrase shunya, that has a meaning of empty, void. Everything is shunya. This has certainly also the meaning of anicca, of transience, but basically it means you can't catch the world in a conceptual net. Just if you try to catch water in a net, it all slips through. If you try to tie up water in a paper package or grab it in your hands, it all flows through. So shunya, it doesn't really mean that the world itself, that the energy of the world is nothing at all. It means that no concept of it is valid. You cannot make any one idea or belief or doctrine or system or theory tie the thing up. And they have then this method. You must understand, of course, that Buddhism is a method, not a doctrine. And the method is a dialogue. What appear that I've given you already now is not the teaching of Buddhism. Buddhism has no teaching. These are the opening gambits in a dialogue. It goes like this. There's a teacher. And incidentally, the teacher is appointed by the student. There are no teachers without students. It's the patient makes the doctor. And you, on your authority, and from reasons known to yourself, you pick on some individual who you think is wiser than you are. And you take your problems to him. Actually, it's your idea that he's wiser than you are. Your opinion, your judgment. And you say to him, I suffer, and I don't want to suffer. And the teacher comes back saying, isn't it obvious that you suffer because you desire, because you cling? Try not to cling. And you go away and you try not to cling. And you find it's rather difficult. And then it comes to you through various suggestions that the teacher has handed out, that you are desiring not to desire. That your very effort not to cling is a kind of clinging. And you go back and say to the teacher, well, now what? I don't see what I'm to do. So he says, well, see if you can stop desiring not to desire. And you find yourself in a very sticky situation. Because you realize that this is a situation where you can't do anything about it, because anything you do about it will be wrong. And furthermore, it's a situation you can't do nothing about, because doing nothing about it will be a kind of inverse way of trying to do something about it. Like a clever woman, when she really wants to get a man, will pretend to run away from him. So the dialogue between the teacher and the student goes like that. Gets you into this hopeless situation where you can't do nothing and you can't do something. It also involves the teacher of a Buddhist method destroys all your beliefs. Anything you propose in a verbal or intellectual way as a kind of answer to the life problem that you have, he will show you it's full of holes. Every conceivable theory will be destroyed. That's shunya. And people get very nervous when this happens. You might think it was merely an intellectual discussion, but the emotions start flying when the teacher begins to demolish everything. Well, they say, after he's argued you out of every position you can take, they say, well, what do you believe in? What would you propose as a constructive answer? He doesn't say anything. But they look at him again, they see he's not out of his mind. He seems to be all right. But that's the method, you see, to get rid of all your intellectual hang-ups. All your ideas, metaphysical ideas, philosophical ideas. It goes beyond that. The idea of who you are, what your role is, all that. All that is shown to be a mere facade. It's like teaching a person to swim by just kicking him into the water. It's dangerous, too. A lot of people go crazy when all their props are taken out from under them. But if you are willing to try, to take the risk, it's the best way. I call it spiritual window cleaning. Because if you paint a picture of the sun on the glass, it may be very pretty, but it'll block your vision of the true sun. So you have to scrape it off. So in the same way, all our ideas of God, of the afterlife, of who we ought to be, are paintings on the glass. And they have to be scraped off. So, going on then to what comes out of this. If you go through this and you get completely blown out and released and are in the state of nirvana, for no reason that anybody can explain, just as, for example, as I pointed out, when you see that you can't change yourself, you can't lift yourself up by your own bootstraps, you then get a new access of psychic energy. So in exactly the same way, when you get to this state of nirvana, there wells up from within you what the Buddhists call karuna, or compassion. The sense that you aren't different from everybody else. Everybody else's suffering is your suffering. And so this tremendous sense of solidarity with all other beings arises. So that he who reaches nirvana doesn't, as it were, withdraw into a sort of isolated peace, but is always coming back into the world, into the difficulties, into the problems of life, in compassion for everyone else. You can't be saved alone, because you're not alone. You are the whole cosmos.
Sounds True presents Leave It Be, Session 4, on Taoism, with Alan Watts.
I'm going to talk to you about Taoism, which is one of the principal forms of Chinese philosophy, as it were the opposite number of Confucianism. For these two ways of thought lie at the roots of Chinese civilization, both of them having a kind of common origin in the attitude to life expressed in the Book of Changes, or the I Ching, which may be as early as about 1300 BC. It's a very strange book. It is a commentary on 64 symbols, which are made up of broken and unbroken lines. The unbroken line like this, and the broken line like this. And this unbroken line is called Yang, and the broken line is called Yin. And this is ostensibly a method of decision making. When you flip a coin to make a decision, you've only got two choices. It's either heads or tails. But imagine having a 64-sided coin to flip to help you make decisions. It's rather an interesting idea, because when we do make decisions, we are always eventually reduced to flipping a coin. However well you think it through, you don't have time enough to think it all the way through. You know that there are always possibilities that you didn't take into consideration or couldn't take into consideration. And although you plan and wonder and work out the data, it eventually comes down to the point where you flip a coin, because you've got to make up your mind. But in some respects, you see, a 64-sided coin would be more suggestive, shall we say, than a two-sided coin. Well, anyway, these hexagrams, as they're called in the I Ching, are made up of fundamentally two symbols: Yang, the positive, and Yin, the negative. And the words Yang and Yin seem to refer originally to the south and north sides of a mountain. The south side is the sunny side, the north side the shady side. And note that you cannot possibly have a one-sided mountain. And therefore, it's always understood that the Yang and the Yin are the explicit differences of an implicit unity. The poles. Yang is called male, Yin is called female. And so they constitute a unity. Behind this unity is something represented by an empty circle, which is called Tai Chi, the great ultimate. The word Chi refers to the ridgepole of a roof, on which, of course, the two sides of a roof depend, on which they are propped together, like the two sticks that I talked to you about, which support one another. Take one away, the other collapses. So underneath the whole philosophy of China, there lies this recognition of the polarity of the universe. That the opposites go together, or as Lao Tzu puts it in the second chapter of his book, the Tao Te Ching, when all the world understands beauty to be beautiful, there is already ugliness. When all the world understands goodness to be good, there is already evil. For to be and not to be arise mutually. Neither one is before or after the other. They come into being together. So now, when it comes to Taoism, this is a point of view that becomes explicit in Chinese history probably in the neighborhood of 400 BC. It used to be said that Lao Tzu, Laotzu, was originally thought to have been a contemporary of Confucius, who lived between 600 and 500 BC. But the general weight of scholarly opinion today is that the Lao Tzu book is about 400. And the book is called the Tao Te Ching, because again, there's no apostrophe after the T, so it's pronounced De, and Jing, there is no apostrophe after the CH, so if there were, it would be pronounced Ching, but it's Jing, like a J. And so Jing in Chinese means a classical book or scripture. Dao is usually translated the way, but I would prefer to call it the course of nature. And De means virtue, but in the sense that we use the word virtue when we say the healing virtue of a plant. It has a magical connotation, or a connotation of power and peculiar skill, of Dao and De, and it is written by Lao Tzu, which means the old boy. The legend, of course, is that Lao Tzu was the librarian of the imperial court, who, when he became an old man and sick of the intrigue of court life, decided to vanish into the mountains. But he was detained at the city gate by the captain of the guard, who said, "Sir, we cannot lose you without your leaving behind some record of your wisdom." And so he prevailed upon him to sit in his gatehouse and write down this book, which is a very short, laconical book, and it is divided into two main sections, one about Tao and one about De. He was followed in due course by a number of successors, of which the most important is somebody called Zhuangzi. And this man is really marvelous. He's one of the very few philosophers who have ever lived who was a great humorist. And if you get the modern library edition of The Wisdom of Lao Tzu, translated by Lin Yutang, you will find in that lots of Zhuangzi, translated as a commentary on Lao Tzu. And he is really delightful. He's a delicious person to read, because he has a kind of humor wherein he caricatures his own philosophy and takes it to absurd extremes just for the joke of it. And he puts a lot of his philosophy into the mouth of Confucius just to confuse everyone. He's a really witty man, and you must read him. So then, what I want to do is to discuss the main ideas of Lao Tzu, and of course, naturally, we have to start with Tao. This word in Chinese, it is connected with motion, going on and stopping, or rhythmic motion, on and off. And this other part of the character here means intelligence. So you've got intelligent motion, the course of nature. But the character also means to speak. And so it's rather like the Greek logos. The first verse of Lao Tzu's book starts out by saying something that you really can't translate. Tao can do, can be. Again, Tao. The Tao which can be Tao, not. This character means regular or eternal Tao. And so we normally translate this, the Tao which can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. It could mean also the way which can be weighed, traveled, is not the regular way. Most commentators agree to the first translation. The Tao which can be described is not the eternal Tao. then why go on to write a book about it? Well, consistency is a virtue of small minds. So you have in the idea of Tao the flow of life, the flow of events, the world considered as a stream. And water is very often used by Lao Tzu to give the idea of Tao, because water always takes the line of least resistance. Water is very soft, and yet one of the strongest things in the world. You can chop water with a sword, but leave no wound. You can't squeeze it, you can't compress it. Wonderful stuff. And elsewhere he says, man at his birth is supple and tender, but in death he is rigid and hard. Thus suppleness and tenderness are the marks of life, and rigidity and hardness the marks of death. Tao is always gentle, you see, always yielding. It is feminine, in a way. Lao Tzu says, although you may be a male, always have a certain feminine quality, and thus you will become a universal channel. That has particularly to be learned by men in the United States, who tend to overcompensate masculinity, to be ashamed of gentleness, and to emphasize a kind of attitude to life, which usually indicates a fear of incipient homosexuality. And as a result, we have a lot of misunderstanding between men and women, because each one is so busy being their particular sex that they have nothing in common. So this idea then is the strength of gentleness. And of course it is ultimately on this philosophy that the Japanese worked out the science of judo. Do is the way the Japanese pronounce Tao. Ju means gentle. Judo, the gentle way, whereby a strong man is alarmingly defeated by the use of his own strength against himself. And the analogy is, of course, of the pine tree and the willow tree. The pine tree is a muscle man. And when the snow piles up and becomes icy, the pine tree branch cracks. But when the willow gets snow on it, after a little while the branch drops and the snow falls off and the branch springs up again. That's judo. They teach you in Japan a mysterious science called Aikido. Again, do meaning Tao. Aikido is the inner or esoteric aspect of judo. And they can teach you, for example, to hold out your arm in such a way that no one can bend it, however strong. But it all depends on your not using effort to hold it out. You must not resist. There is a certain way of doing that. So this Tao cannot be defined. That's basic. Just because it is the flow of nature, you can't capture it. You can't shut up wind in a box and expect it to be wind. You can't catch flowing water in a bucket, because the minute it's in the bucket, it's no longer flowing. Now, Tao means roughly what we would mean by the basic energy of the world. There are two things to be said about it. And the first is that it is not a governing energy. Here we clearly come up against a principle or a concept of nature in which there is no government. This is an anarchic view of the universe. Not in the sense of chaos, but equally not in the sense of what we mean by order. The Tao does not rule. Lao Tzu says, the great Tao flows everywhere, both to the left and to the right. It loves and nourishes all things, but does not lord it over them. And when merits are accomplished, that is, good things are accomplished, it lays no claim to them. In fact, the Tao is always self-effacing, always disappears, always indefinable, always behind the scenes. And so, in a way, Lao Tzu's book is written as a manual of advice to rulers. And his idea of a good ruler is one who is never in evidence. Do you know, for example, in Hinsdale, the name of your sanitation chief? I bet you don't. But he's a very, very important official. And Lao Tzu would advise the President of the United States to behave like the chief of sanitation. To be unobtrusive and to generally leave things alone. Let things take their course. Not in the sense of, well, it's like this. It's the difference between rowing and sailing. When you row, it's a relatively stupid method of propulsion because you have to use effort. When you sail, you use the wind. But you don't have to go the way the wind is blowing. You can tack. And tacking in so as to go in an opposite direction to the wind is the art of Taoism. Anyone who really understands sailing understands Lao Tzu. So the next thing is that the Tao has a kind of order, but it's not quite what we mean by order. When we speak of order, we usually tend to think of something symmetrical, of something like a library, you know, where all the shelves are rectangular. But the Chinese have a word for order, for the order of the universe, which is this. They pronounce it Li. Now this sign has the original meaning of the markings in jade, or the grain in wood, or the fiber in muscle. So now, when you look at a cloud, or at foam patterns, or at grain patterns in wood, you know for some reason or other that you're not looking at a mess. You're looking at something decidedly wiggly, but aesthetically pleasing. But you can't figure it out. There are no rules which it follows. For in this word has been translated the principle or rationale of nature, almost the law of nature. But the Chinese have no word for the law of nature. They do have a word for law, the word Zi. Zi. And this word Zi, written this way, was originally written like this. And that represented a cauldron, an iron cauldron, with a knife beside it for scratching on the cauldron. Because in very distant times, certain emperors had the laws of the land written on the sacrificial cauldrons to which the people brought offerings, so that when they offered the sacrifices, they could read the laws. But certain sages said you should never do that, because if you write the laws down, people will develop a litigious spirit. They will always be yakking over what it means. And therefore lawyers will have to define them more carefully. And then other lawyers will drive a carriage with 6 horses right through that. And then other lawyers must again define the laws more carefully. And that's the state we're in today, where we are utterly hamstrung by law. So the Tao is described as being Wu Zi. Wu means is this character, non-legal. The Tao is non-legal in its nature, but it is this, it is Li. And that means orderly in a way that cannot be defined. Just like your own nervous system is certainly orderly, but nobody has been able to figure out the principle of it. But you know at once, without being able to say how, the difference between Li and rigidity and Li and mess, chaos. So what you might call the best way of translating Li into English is to call it organic pattern. That's what it is. But we don't really know what that is because we are it. We are organic pattern. And just as we can't bite our own teeth, we cannot define our own organization. We are it, and that's all we need to be, because the teeth don't need to bite themselves. A saw doesn't need to cut itself. The sun doesn't need to illuminate itself. So then this is the principle of Tao, but it is not law. If it were law, of course, the Tao which could be spoken would be the eternal Tao. But it can't be uttered. So Tao then is the principle of nature. And in Chinese, nature is called really spontaneity. We use the word nature for the Chinese expression ziran. They pronounce J like a sort of unrolled R. I mean, that's the scholars did this to confuse you. Ziran means of itself so. Self-so. Almost our word automatic, except that automatic has a mechanical sense, and this doesn't. When you have belly rumbles or hiccups, you don't intend to have them. It happens of itself. In the same way, you don't intend to beat your heart. It happens of itself. You didn't intend to get born. It happened of itself. This is ziran. And so this word means nature. Dai ziran, or the Japanese pronounce it shizen, is roughly when they point to all the things happening around us, that's ziran. And you see that ziran, that which is so of itself implies no boss. So in the same way they would look at the human body. Zhuangzi discusses the human body and says, which organ do you prefer? And shows there is no chief organ. There could be an argument between the brain and the stomach. One school of thought would say, well, obviously the stomach is the most important organ because that's where the food goes and is distributed to everywhere else. And stomachs came first. Then later, on the upper end of the input channel to the stomach, there were evolved ganglia of nerves to enable the stomach better to scratch around for things to put into it. And therefore the brain serves the stomach. The other school of thought would say, well, no, it isn't that things which come first aren't necessarily the most important. The stomach is to the brain as John the Baptist was to Jesus. The stomach is there, but to nourish the brain. The stomach is the servant of the brain, which is, of course, preoccupied with higher things that we call culture. But you see, both arguments will stand up and both will fail, because the stomach and the brain have a mutuality between each other. They arise mutually. And there is no way of deciding which of the major organs of the body is top dog, because the body is a sort of democracy in which, by mutual cooperation, things happen without any preconceived plan. We think in the West that the order of nature has a plan underneath, that there was, as it were, the original blueprint in the mind of God, which is the Logos, the second person of the Trinity. But the Chinese don't think that way. they would agree with the limerick. Well, I mean, they wouldn't, but they would agree with the humor of it. There was a young man who said, "Damn, for it certainly seems that I am a creature that moves in determinate grooves. I'm not even a bus, I'm a tram." But the Chinese do not think of any rails laid down, as it were, or rules laid down, upon which nature has to travel. They think simply that it organizes itself, but doesn't know how. Again, we're back to the centipede, which manages 100 legs without thinking, because thinking would embarrass it. That sort of thing, it is called in Chinese putting legs on a snake, you see. The snake needs no legs. And explaining the universe by a governor who dominates it is called legs on a snake. It's like saying, we have an instinct to do this, that, and the other. When people talk about instincts, watch out. They're invoking ghosts. When we say we have an instinct to survive, it means simply that we do survive, in fact, until we don't. And if you want to explain the curious fact that people seem to want to survive, you call it an instinct to survive. This is learned gobbledygook. There was a time sometimes when you showed a physician or a scientist some peculiar thing which he didn't understand. He would look at it, put on his spectacles, examine it from various points of view and make a few notes, and then say, "It is a lusus naturae." And everybody said, "Wonderful. He knows what it is, a lusus naturae." But it means it is a game of nature. A freak. And you will find that many, many medical people practice this sort of gobbledygook. You have a pain. They say it's neuritis. It means simply that neuritis means your nerves hurt. So it's always good to translate medical language back into English, and you begin to get some idea of what's happening. Now the next thing to take up is the word de. And as I said, this means virtue, power, sometimes magic. When we say a person is a virtuoso, we have something of the meaning of de in it. Marvelous accomplishment. And in opening the section on de, Lao Tzu says, superior virtue is not virtue, and thus is virtue. Inferior virtue cannot let go of virtue, and thus is not virtue. Or we might say, a person who really has virtue is not striving for virtue, and thus really has it. A person of inferior virtue is so trying to be virtuous that he's not virtuous. In other words, when the person is trying and striving for virtue, he is being self-conscious and artificial. And we say, well, so-and-so is very good, but isn't he rather forced? Isn't he a bit phony? And it's so often the case that people who are reputedly very virtuous are very boring. You feel that sometimes people are so good that you are sitting on the edge of your chair in their presence, and that you can't relax with them or let your hair down, because they're full of judgment and disapproval, because they are always judging and disapproving of themselves. A really virtuous person doesn't show his virtue. He is like, well, there's a poem in Chinese which says, entering the forest, he doesn't disturb a blade of grass. Entering the water, he doesn't make a ripple. He looks very ordinary. And so his virtue can't be detected. He doesn't stink of virtue. So, de, then, is the virtue of the great artist, say, or craftsman, who creates marvelous works of art, but always as if he was making no effort. And so we say of great art that it's artless, that it seems to come naturally, that he does it as if he were falling off a log. Now, of course, we know that it isn't that simple. But nevertheless, it does seem to be. So what everybody wants to know then is how to acquire that great naturalness in everything, so that we, in our human lives, manifest the Tao. Tao manifested through man is De. How do you do it? So the transitional word, which shows the way to realize De in one's life, and then with this character, this is pronounced, this one is Wu, this one is Wei, Wu Wei. Wei means to act, to strain, to strive, or to interfere. And so the Taoist manner of life is Wu Wei. Don't force it. Always go with the stream. You may need to use a rudder, but don't ever go against the stream. If you are swimming and you're caught in a very strong current, you'll be lost if you try to swim against it. You must swim with it and edge to the side. That's Wu Wei. This has been very well understood, even by the samurai in Japan, who, when they became very great, real masters of swordsmanship, always found out and belonged to the no-sword school, because the real master of the sword never uses one. There is a story that there were in Japan in ancient times 2 master swordsmiths, and there was a great debate as to which of them was the better. So some soldiers took a sword made by each master and decided to test them out. They first took a sword made by the man who, in general opinion, was perhaps a little inferior. And they went to a stream and they dipped the sword in the stream with the edge of the blade facing upstream. They dropped a piece of paper on the stream, and it floated towards the sword, and as it floated, the sword simply divided it in two. The 2 pieces of paper joined together on the other side and went on down the stream.